in its wake tonight, we can say to the men of violence all across Northern Ireland, to those who disdain democracy,
every day, nearly, from 1969 right on up to, you heard somebody was getting killed or there was an explosion.
I went into this agreement because I was not prepared to tolerate a situation of continuing violence.
Our purpose is to secure equal recognition and respect for the two identities in Northern Ireland.
I want to offer hope to young people particularly.
When I was just 11 years old, I went to a school in the Clonard area of Belfast. And in 1969, that whole street of houses was burnt by the Unionists.
I just ask for a clear-cut, unequivocal assurance that violence is over for good.
بعد مرور أكثر من نصف قرن على الصراع في جزيرة إيرلندا، ترى في بلفاست أسواراً عالية فاصلة وجداريات لا تزال قائمة إلى اليوم، تجسد الولاءات والاستعداد للتضحية بالنفس في سبيل ما يعتبرها كل طرف قضيته.
In Northern Ireland, you've got a lot of peace walls, so-called peace walls, because at points the residents there feel safer with peace walls where they can't be attacked. And you've seen the barriers that open and will close and lock during times of high tension. Probably most people in an ideal world would not like those barriers and peace walls to be there. But unfortunately, we don't live in an ideal world.
يعود تاريخ الصراع في إيرلندا الشمالية إلى بداية عام 1920، وذلك بعد أن انفصلت عن إيرلندا إذانا بنهاية قرون من حكم المملكة المتحدة لجزيرة إيرلندا التي انقسمت إلى جمهورية إيرلندا وإيرلندا الشمالية التي بقيت تابعة للمملكة.
Ireland is made up of 32 counties. 26 counties received a measure of independence, and the 6 counties here in the northeast of Ireland were given over to Unionist control. The border was created on the basis of a sectarian gerrymandered head count so that Unionists would have a majority.
هذه التبعية قسمت مواطني إيرلندا الشمالية إلى فريقين. الأول الوحدويون، وهم مؤيدون للعرش البريطاني ويعتنقون المذهب البروتستانتي، والفريق الثاني القوميون أو الجمهوريون، يطالبون بانفصال إيرلندا الشمالية عن المملكة والانضمام لجمهورية إيرلندا ويعتنقون المذهب الكاثوليكي.
The great injustice in Ireland is the partition of Ireland, and that partition in itself doesn't justify, in my view, the taking of life.
مع بداية ستينيات القرن الماضي تحول الصراع بين الطرفين إلى عنف مسلح استمر لأكثر من 3 عقود وخلف أكثر من 3500 قتيل.
It's very frightening, alleviate the fear that both communities have about walls and barriers. And I've always said you You can take down, you know, all the barriers and all that you want, but you have to take the barriers down in people's minds and mindsets, because people have been living with barriers. Some of them have been living with barriers from they were born, you know. Some have been living with barriers from the beginning of the Troubles.
I was born in 1976, so they'd already started. So I suppose life for me was, I didn't know what normal was, because I was brought up through segregation and violence.
I wouldn't want my kids growing up in the type of life that I grew up in the war.
When I was a young child growing up, you know, you weren't allowed to play at the bottom of the street, you weren't allowed to play at the top of the street for fear of gunshots coming along, you know, and that's from an early age. You couldn't go anywhere in your school uniform in case anybody recognised you.
في 12 من آب أغسطس عام 1969 اندلعت اشتباكات في لندن ديري بين الوحدويين والجمهوريين الذين أطلقوا على المدينة اسم ديري. بعد يومين تم نشر القوات البريطانية، وفي كانون الأول ديسمبر عام 1969 بدأ تأسيس المنظمة شبه العسكرية القومية، الجيش الجمهوري الإيرلندي.
When I was just 11 years old, I went to a school in the Clonard area of Belfast, and my school sat at the right angle where two streets met, and one of those streets was known as Bombay Street. And in 1969, that whole street of houses was burnt by the unionists, led in by the police, the Royal Ulster Constabulary, and the auxiliary force of the B Specials.
These Land Rovers being blown up, people being shot dead in local pubs, searching and then when you go to do shopping in town.
تورط الجيش الإنجليزي في أحداث العنف بمقابل قوات الجيش الإيرلندي والفئات التابعة له من المتطوعين. ففي 9 من آب أغسطس عام 1971 سجنت القوات البريطانية دون محاكمة 342 قوميا للاشتباه بارتكابهم أنشطة إرهابية، ومنذ ذلك الحين وصفت أساليب الاستجواب بأنها تعذيب.
Remember sitting listening to the TV in January 1972 when news began to come in about civil rights protesters having been shot dead on the streets in Derry by British paratroopers. 14 unarmed civilians were gunned down by the British Army.
أجج ذلك أعمال العنف والاحتجاج، حيث قتل 470 شخصا، بينهم 14 قتلوا على يد مظليين بريطانيين خلال تظاهرة في لندن ديري للكاثوليك في 30 من كانون الثاني يناير عام 1972 فيما بات يعرف بالأحد الدامي. ونتيجة لذلك تم حل برلمان إيرلندا الشمالية، وتولت لندن إدارة شؤون المقاطعة بشكل مباشر.
And people gunned down on the street on a Sunday afternoon. And I think at that point, people realised that there wasn't going to be any peaceful resolution to the problems here.
حركة أخوية أورنج أو الأخوية البرتقالية ما زالت ترمز إلى الصراع المذهبي في جزيرة إيرلندا. تنظم الحركة إلى اليوم مسيرة سنوية تجوب فيها شوارع المدينة بزي موحد قارعة الطبول في 12 من تموز من كل عام، تسمى محليا 12 اعتقادا بانتمائها الديني والسياسي.
Our parades have happened largely without any breaks since 1795 when the institution was formed, and right throughout those years of the terrorist campaign here, I think there was much more resolve in our community to ensure that our traditions and identity were seen and respected. This is an outward manifestation of our culture. and it was important to our community throughout those years of the 1970s and 80s and 90s that very much that tradition continued and wasn't suppressed in those years.
Well, the marching season is always a very sensitive time of year, and it has been the source of great conflict. Often nationalists will leave Northern Ireland and go to Donegal to avoid the tensions that arise at that time. But trouble can occur at any time during the year, but it's particularly heightened during the marching season and the 12th, when politics is taken into the streets.
Catholics march in one direction, Protestants, accompanied by the blare of martial music, march in the other.
اعتقلت القوات الإنجليزية الكثير من التابعين للجيش الإيرلندي خلال فترة الحرب، وشهدت السجون أحداثا كثيرة، كان منها إضراب امتنع فيه السجناء عن الطعام احتجاجا على ظروف حجزهم في حرب بدت لن تنقضي أبدا.
And in 1972 there was a hunger strike in Belfast prison which ended before anyone died, and our demand was for political status, and the British conceded special category status, which was political status in everything but name. Our comrades were allowed to organise their own life within the prison. They didn't have to wear prison uniforms or do prison work. They could do education. So we were absolutely determined to continue resisting within the prison. And Bobby decided that he would lead another hunger strike beginning on the 1st of March 1981.
حولت الإضرابات عن الطعام السياق السياسي لمشكلة إيرلندا الشمالية، وأظهر السجناء الجمهوريون الاستعداد لقبول المعاناة من أجل قضيتهم، وعندها حققت الحركة الجمهورية انتصارا هائلا على الحكومة البريطانية، وحصلت على الكثير من التعاطف الدولي.
While Bobby was on hunger strike in April 1981, one of the MPs for Fermanagh South Tyrone died suddenly, and the Unionists moved a writ in Westminster to have a by-election. It was decided that Bobby Sands would stand in that by-election, and at that time you have to remember that Maggie Thatcher, the British Prime Minister, had said that the IRA had no support and that the prisoners had no support. But history shows that the people of Fermanagh and South Tyrone came out in their thousands and elected Bobby Sands as a member of the British Parliament.
Bobby Sands is dead. The 27-year-old member of the Irish Republican Army who went on a protest hunger strike 66 days ago has died.
الحكومة البريطانية كانت تخشى من أن يتفوق سين فين على الحزب الديمقراطي الاجتماعي وحزب العمال باعتباره الممثل الرئيسي للسكان الكاثوليك في إيرلندا الشمالية، ما دفعها إلى توقيع الاتفاقية الأنجلو إيرلندية في 15 من نوفمبر عام 1985 من قبل رئيسة الوزراء البريطانية مارغريت تاتشر والإيرلندي جاريت فيزجيرالد. هذه الاتفاقية أعطت حكومة إيرلندا دورا استشاريا رسميا في شؤون إيرلندا الشمالية.
The purpose is to try to bring together and to support all of those people in Northern Ireland who wish to end violence and to proceed in a democratic way.
And at some stage, the British government must have realised that rather than being able to isolate and marginalise Republicans, it had had exactly the opposite effect. And at that stage, particularly when Tony Blair came along in the 1990s, that they realised the only way of ending the conflict here was through an inclusive, an all-inclusive negotiated process, and that's what happened.
اكتسبت عملية السلام زخما في عام 1993، وبعد جولات من المفاوضات متعددة الأطراف انتصر صوت العقل والحكمة، ونجحت إيرلندا الشمالية في تجاوز الاقتتال الأهلي وولت وجهها شطر الاستقرار والتنمية والسلام.
We see this agreement, this treaty, as addressing the wounds that have damaged our society and ensuring that our diverse traditions attract respect, and above all, as laying the foundations for a healthy, vibrant democracy to replace the stagnation, frustration and powerlessness of the last 3 decades.
وبعد سنتين من المفاوضات و3 عقود من الصراع المسلح، تم إعلان اتفاق الجمعة العظيمة عام 1998 إذانا بتشكيل حكومة جديدة تجمع بين طرفي النزاع. مفاوضات حل النزاع شارك فيها كل من الحكومتين البريطانية والإيرلندية والعديد من الدول بما فيها الولايات المتحدة والاتحاد الأوروبي، الذي وعد بتقديم 400 مليون يورو لدعم إيرلندا الشمالية.
This agreement proves that democracy works, and in its wake tonight, we can say to the men of violence all across Northern Ireland, to those who disdain democracy, to those whose tools are bombs and bullets, your way is not the right way. You will never solve the problems of Northern Ireland by violence.
اعتبرت واشنطن عرابة هذا الاتفاق من خلال الدبلوماسي جورج ميتشل ذي الأصول الإيرلندية، الذي كان مبعوثا شخصيا للرئيس الأمريكي آنذاك بيل كلينتون، وهو من أعلن الاتفاق، وبذلك تعد الولايات المتحدة هي الضامنة لهذا الاتفاق.
Good luck. Have a happy Easter. God bless all the people of Northern Ireland.
I suppose when the Good Friday Agreement was signed, I was pregnant with my first daughter, so I felt happy in the thought that society was going to change, that she wouldn't grow up in the life that I had to grow up in. And I think many people felt the same way, you know, it was a new hope, a new future for Northern Ireland.
أبرز بنود الاتفاق: تشكيل برلمان شمال إيرلندا للتعامل مع القضايا المحلية، سمي بمجلس إيرلندا الشمالي North Ireland Assembly، نزع السلاح وإزالة الحواجز الأمنية التي وضعت أثناء الحرب بين الطرفين، تشكيل مجلس لتطوير التعاون ما بين إيرلندا الشمالية وجمهورية إيرلندا في مجالي الصحة والزراعة، السماح بحمل جواز السفر البريطاني والإيرلندي معا لمن يرغب. كما تضمن الاتفاق بندا جدليا للمجتمع الإيرلندي الشمالي، حيث أطلق سراح المعتقلين المتورطين في القتل بشكل فوري وغير مشروط.
When they released the prisoners through the Good Friday Agreement, many people were for it, many people were against it, depending whether you were a victim, a survivor, or whether you were part of an organisation who was getting their prisoners released. Did it help bring about the peace process? It probably did in an aspect, to get people around the table. Was it a good idea or not? I don't, everybody's view is different.
And I was released about 6 months after the signing of the Good Friday Agreement. Had it not been for the Good Friday Agreement, I would have been in prison for another 10 years. I had been convicted of trying to kill members of the British Crown Forces. It was controversial in some circles, mainly among our enemies, who didn't want to see the Irish Republican prisoners released, because that in itself was an acknowledgement that we were political prisoners. and when conflicts and war ends, all the combatants are released from prison.
It's very difficult to say to those who are victims of IRA or loyalist violence, to say to them, well, as part of this peace deal, we're going to let out these prisoners. But pragmatically, there didn't really seem to be any other way. And it's not just the paramilitary prisoners that are involved. The British government has also been involved in carrying out torture and shoot-to-kill policies. It's been involved in a dirty war in Northern Ireland. So it's understandable that on all sides there are grievances. But again, Northern Ireland is really about what is pragmatic in terms of getting peace. But having said that, it's very difficult to explain that to people who've been victims of violent conflict and who want justice.
The Good Friday Agreement was a difficult time for our community. The Unionist Protestant community here was very much divided in its support, and this organisation, the Orange Institution, actually opposed the agreement at the time. And that was for a number of reasons. We were coming out of a period of intense internal terrorism, and some of the measures that were proposed as part of the agreement, such as the release of prisoners, the willingness to go into government with people who had been inextricably linked to that terrorist campaign, and at that time without the promise of permanent ceasefire or decommissioning weapons, I think was a step too far for many of our people at that time. But a large proportion of the unionist community did vote, and you know, that was that. We're a democratic organisation, so we respect the mandate of that period.
We've got to know that the gun really is going to be taken out of Irish politics, that the weapons really are going to go in the way that the Good Friday Agreement determines, and in the way that we are committed to doing.
The vast majority of volunteers in the Irish Republican Army supported the leadership in their negotiation of the Good Friday Agreement, and they agreed to abide by the ceasefire and eventually to dump all our weapons, to put our weapons beyond use.
I felt good. I felt okay, you know. It took a long time to come round. There was a lot of ups and downs and ins and outs, and you know, but I think they got there in the end. Now, not everybody is happy with it. There's parts of it, you know, we're all not happy with in both communities, but I think it's something that we really need to work at if we want to keep peace.
الاتفاق التاريخي نجح بفضل نشاط مؤسسات المجتمع المدني في الجامعات والكنائس والمؤسسات التربوية، والذي ساهم بشكل فاعل في نشر قيم السلام والتعارف والتسامح بين الكاثوليك والبروتستانت، وأيضا إنشاء هيئات دستورية وقانونية واجتماعية معنية بتطبيق بنود الاتفاق.
I think the negotiators of the Good Friday Agreement did a pretty good job. Given the circumstances that they were in, public opinion didn't think a deal could be done, and most people going up to the final week of negotiations didn't believe that there could be a deal because the positions were so far apart. So the deal that they agreed was ambiguous and a fudge, but it was probably the best that could have been achieved in the circumstances.
Well, people thought they were going to get a brighter future. In the beginning, for many years, people within working class communities didn't get anything, and I would still say today that they still don't. They still haven't benefited or reaped from the Good Friday Agreement. People still live in poverty. They still live in segregation. You know, everybody still has problems associated, stress, depression, mental health issues, all associated with the Troubles, and they still haven't been dealt with.
This election means that getting Brexit done is now the irrefutable, irresistible, unarguable decision of the British people.
تحول الاتفاق الذي أرسى السلام في إيرلندا إلى حجر الزاوية في تحديد علاقة المملكة المتحدة مع الاتحاد الأوروبي، لكن ملف البريكسيت المتمثل في خروج بريطانيا من الاتحاد الأوروبي وضع الاتفاق على المحك.
Now it's left the EU, we now have a border to some extent down the Irish Sea, and that antagonises unionists. So these issues, do carry the potential to revive some of the previous antagonisms. However, at the moment, the political forces in Northern Ireland that are dominant are working to prevent that from reasserting itself. And as long as they are doing that, then there's every chance that the peace process continues. But we can't afford to be complacent.
ليس متحف سفينة تايتانيك التي بنيت في بيلفاست هو المقصد الوحيد الذي يذكر بكارثة بشرية، إذ يقصد أهالي وزوار المدينة أضرحة مشتركة تضم ضحايا حرب أهلية باتت من الماضي وتحولت إلى درس تاريخي. فاتفاق الجمعة العظيمة الذي أرسى السلام في إيرلندا أظهر إمكانية فض أي نزاع في العالم مهما اختلف مكانه وزمانه، وإن كان دمويا وطويلا ومدمرا، في حال انتصر صوت العقل والحكمة بين الأطراف المتصارعة، وتقاطع ذلك مع دعم دولي يسعى بصدق لإحلال السلام والأمن والاستقرار، وينحاز لحقوق الإنسان والكرامة الإنسانية.